Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I'm a night nurse at a private clinic. The dark web says we're housing possessed patients. Last night, one of them said my full name and address without ever meeting me. Hey Reddit, I don't usually post stuff like this, but I feel like I'm losing it, and I need to put this out there. Maybe it's paranoia, or maybe it's something worse, but I feel like I'm being watched. So, I'm a night nurse at this private clinic. It's not your average medical facility. Think more of a long-term care center for people who can't go to regular hospitals. Rich families pay a fortune to house their difficult relatives here. Some patients are physically ill, but most have severe psychiatric disorders, or at least that's what we're told. The clinic is tucked away in a heavily wooded area about an hour outside of any major city. It's this old, imposing building that used to be a mansion or something. Imagine dark hallways, flickering fluorescent lights, and an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional scream or outburst from one of the patients. Sounds fun, right? Most nights are uneventful. We have a skeleton crew. Me, another nurse named Carl, and a couple of security guards. We rarely get visitors. The families prefer to deal with the administration during daylight hours, which leaves us alone with the patients at night. About a month ago, Carl started showing me these creepy posts he found on the dark web. Now, I'm not tech savvy, so I have no idea how he even got there. But he was obsessed. He claimed there was a whole thread dedicated to our clinic. According to these posts, we weren't housing psychiatric patients. We were keeping possessed individuals. Yeah, like full-on exorcist stuff. At first, I laughed it off. The posts were full of crazy conspiracy theories about shadowy organizations, demonic rituals, and secret experiments. They even had blurry photos of our building, which made me think it was probably just some locals trying to scare people. Carl thought it was hilarious, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Last night started off like any other. It was raining, and the sound of water hitting the old windows was the only thing keeping me awake. Carl called out sick, so I was alone with the guards. There are 3 floors in the clinic, but only the 3rd floor houses patients. The rest of the building is storage and admin offices. Around 2 a.m., I was doing my rounds. Most of the patients were asleep or sedated, except for one, a woman named Lila. She's in her late 20s, pale as a ghost, with these piercing blue eyes that feel like they're drilling into your soul. She doesn't speak much, but when she does, it's always something unsettling. When I peeked into her room, she was sitting up in bed, staring at the wall. Her head turned slowly when she saw me, and I swear she smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the kind that makes your stomach drop. I asked her if she needed anything, but she just kept smiling. "You're being watched, you know," she said. That's not unusual for Lila. She says weird stuff like that all the time. I tried to brush it off and told her to get some rest, but as I turned to leave, she said something that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have let him read those posts." I froze. How could she know about the dark web posts? I hadn't mentioned them to anyone except Carl, and I doubted he was discussing clinic gossip with the patients. I turned back to her, but she was already lying down, her back to me. By the time I got back to the nurse's station, my head was spinning. I wanted to text Carl and ask if he told anyone, but my phone was dead. Of course. So I grabbed a coffee and tried to shake it off. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise. It was faint, like footsteps, but not heavy enough to be one of the guards. I checked the security cameras, but the feed for the third-floor hallway was static. That's when I heard it again, closer this time. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. The hallway was empty, but Lila's door was slightly open. Normally, we keep them locked at night for safety reasons, so this was odd. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Lila was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the window, where the rain was pouring down in sheets. "Lila, are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't answer. Instead, she started whispering. It was too quiet to make out at first, but as I got closer, I realized she was whispering my name. Claire. Claire Anderson. I felt like my heart stopped. My ID badge says C. Anderson, but there's no way she could have known my full name. I barely even go by Claire outside of work. Then she said something that made my legs buckle. 1319 Willow Lane, apartment 4B. That's my address. I backed out of the room, shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. How could she possibly know where I lived? My first thought was that Carl was playing some kind of sick joke, but Carl didn't even know my address. No one here does. I locked Lila's door and ran back to the nurse's station. The guards were nowhere to be found. I checked the cameras again, and now the feeds for the entire third floor were down. My gut was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't just abandon the patients. That's when I saw the shadow. It was in the corner of the hallway on the first floor, just barely out of the camera's range. It didn't move, but it didn't feel right. Like it wasn't a person, but something pretending to be. I don't know what's going on, Reddit. I feel like I'm caught in something way bigger than me, and I don't know who to trust. If anyone has any idea what I should do, please let me know. I'll update if anything else happens. I didn't leave the nurse's station for what felt like hours. My hands were shaking so badly, I spilled half my coffee, just trying to pick it up. Every small sound made me jump. Pipes creaking, the rain tapping against the windows, the buzz of the dying fluorescent lights above me. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that Lila was just messing with me, that someone had leaked my address as a joke. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The third floor cameras stayed offline, but I kept staring at the monitor showing the first floor hallway. The shadow I'd seen in the corner was gone now, which honestly made things worse. I was starting to wonder if I'd even seen it at all. Maybe my brain was just screwing with me after the thing with Lila. Then I heard the sound of footsteps again. They were soft but deliberate, and they weren't coming from the patient rooms upstairs. No, these were closer. On the first floor, the clinic is old, and sound carries weirdly through the walls, but I was sure of it. Someone, or something, was walking just outside the nurse's station. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I grabbed the flashlight and edged toward the door. I don't know what I thought I was going to do if I found someone. Shine a light at them until they apologized for scaring me. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. It stretched out in both directions, long and dimly lit, with doors to supply closets and empty offices lining the walls. I called out, "Hello?" Is someone there? My voice sounded shaky, even to me. Nothing. Just the distant rumble of thunder outside. I was about to turn back when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. At the far end of the hallway, one of the supply closet doors was slightly ajar. It creaked open just a little more as I stared at it, like someone or something was trying to bait me into coming closer. And because I'm an idiot, it worked. I walked down the hall as quietly as I could, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The closer I got to the door, the colder the air felt, like I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. My breath started fogging up in front of me, and I could see frost creeping along the edges of the doorframe. That made no sense. The supply closets don't have ventilation, let alone AC units. I stopped a few feet from the door and shone the flashlight into the crack. The beam caught nothing but darkness. I couldn't even see the back wall of the closet, which should have been there. It was like the light got swallowed up by the shadows. "Hello?" I called out again, this time barely above a whisper. My voice echoed back to me, faint and distorted, like it was being mimicked, and then I heard it, a low, guttural breathing, coming from inside the closet, slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to stay quiet, but couldn't quite manage it. I didn't wait to see what it was. I slammed the door shut and bolted back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. I locked the door behind me and pressed my back against it, listening for any signs of movement, but the hallway stayed silent. After a few minutes, I worked up the nerve to check the cameras again. The first floor feed was fine, and the hallway was still empty. But when I flipped to the second floor, my stomach dropped. The shadow was back. It was standing at the top of the staircase, just barely within the camera's range. This time, I could make out more detail. It wasn't just a shape. It looked like a man, tall and thin, with his head tilted at an odd angle, like his neck couldn't quite support the weight. His arms hung limply at his sides, but his hands were twisted, the fingers too long and crooked to be human. He didn't move, just stood there, swaying slightly. I couldn't see his face. His head was turned toward the wall, but even through the grainy footage, I could feel his presence, like he was staring right at me through the monitor. And then he started walking. It wasn't normal walking, though. His movements were jerky and uneven, like a marionette being dragged along by invisible strings. He moved down the hallway and out of the camera's range, heading straight for the stairs to the third floor. I scrambled for the walkie-talkie to call the security guards, but there was nothing but static on the other end. I tried the landline next, but it was dead, too. My phone was still out of battery, and the charging station at the nurse's station hadn't worked in years. I was completely cut off. I thought about running, about leaving the clinic and not looking back. But then I thought about the patients. As much as they creeped me out, I couldn't just abandon them. And besides, where would I even go? The nearest gas station was miles away, and the storm outside was getting worse. I decided to head upstairs. Stupid, I know, but I couldn't just sit there and wait for something to happen. I grabbed a scalpel from the emergency kit, because that's totally going to help against whatever this thing was, and started up the stairs. The third floor was eerily quiet. The only light came from the flickering bulbs overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I could hear the faint hum of the generator in the distance, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. As I walked past the patient rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every door I passed felt like it was hiding something, like the patients were pressed up against the glass, waiting for me to let my guard down. When I reached Lila's room, I stopped. Her door was locked, but I could hear her laughing on the other side. It wasn't her usual quiet, unsettling giggle. This was louder, almost manic. It echoed through the hallway, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it sound like there were a dozen voices joining her. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. I kept walking, my flashlight sweeping over the empty hallway. The further I went, the colder it got, until my breath was fogging up again. I rounded a corner, and that's when I saw him. The man from the camera. He was standing at the far end of the hallway, his head still tilted at that impossible angle. His eyes, or where his eyes should have been, were fixed on me, dark and empty, like the closet I'd seen earlier. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, watching me. I froze. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like I was rooted to the spot, like the air around me had turned to concrete. And then, slowly, he raised one of his twisted hands and pointed at me. That's when the lights went out. The second the lights cut out, the air changed. It was heavier somehow, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. My flashlight flickered wildly, the beam jumping across the walls, creating warped shadows that seemed to stretch and shift on their own. The hallway was plunged into near total darkness, except for the weak, stuttering glow of my flashlight. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear something, anything, in the pitch-black silence. But the only sound was my own breathing, shallow and ragged. The man from the hallway, the one with the broken, jerky movements, he was gone. Or at least, I couldn't see him anymore. A deep, bone-chilling cold settled over me, the kind that seeps into your skin and wraps around your spine. My breath fogged the air as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to stop flickering. I felt exposed, like there were eyes on me from every direction, lurking just beyond the beam of light. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper. It was faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, but it grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding me. A dozen voices, maybe more, overlapping and echoing in the darkness. They weren't speaking English, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, mocking, inhuman. I started backing up, my shoes squeaking on the tiled floor. My flashlight caught glimpses of the walls, the doors to the patient rooms, and the faint gleam of the wet floor where rainwater had pooled near a broken window. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, like they were getting closer. My legs felt like jelly, and every step I took felt slower than the last. And then I saw it. The end of the hallway was no longer empty. Standing there, barely illuminated by the faltering beam of my flashlight, was something. It wasn't the man I'd seen before. This was different. It was taller, thinner, with impossibly long limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its face was wrong, stretched too tight over its skull, with hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. Its mouth was wide, too wide, filled with jagged teeth that glinted in the dim light. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with that hollow, gaping face. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was locked in place, every muscle frozen in sheer terror. The thing tilted its head, mimicking the same broken angle as the man from before, and took a step forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. "Claire," it whispered. Its voice was raspy, guttural, and impossibly deep. The way it said my name sent a jolt of icy terror through my chest. I bolted. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second, I was frozen in place, and the next, I was sprinting down the hallway, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The whispers followed me, louder now, overlapping and distorted, like they were coming from inside my head. The hallway seemed endless. No matter how fast I ran, the doors on either side of me stretched on forever, and the corners of my vision blurred with static, like an old TV on a dead channel. I tried to focus, tried to force my legs to move faster, but the air felt thick, like I was running through water. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station. The door was still locked, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice before finally getting the door open. I slammed it shut behind me and locked it again, leaning against it as I struggled to catch my breath. The monitors were still on, their faint glow casting eerie shadows across the room. I forced myself to look at the third-floor feed, hoping against hope that whatever I'd seen was gone. It wasn't. The cameras were back online, but the images they showed didn't make any sense. The hallways were empty, but the footage was distorted, the walls bending and twisting like a funhouse mirror. Every few seconds, the screen would flicker, and I'd catch glimpses of something, dark shapes darting across the frame, too fast to make out. And then, for a split second, the feed froze on an image that made my stomach drop. It was me. I was standing in the middle of the hallway, flashlight in hand, staring directly at the camera. But I wasn't moving. My face was blank, expressionless, and my head was tilted at the same unnatural angle as the man I'd seen earlier. And then the screen went black. The walkie-talkie on the desk crackled to life, making me jump. At first, it was just static, but then a voice cut through. It was faint and garbled, but I could make out the words. "Help! Third floor! Hurry!" It was Carl. I grabbed the walkie-talkie and practically screamed into it. "Carl, where are you? What's going on?" The static swallowed my voice, but his reply came through clear as day. "You shouldn't have let them in." My blood turned to ice. Before I could respond, the walkie-talkie went dead, the static replaced by an eerie silence. I didn't know what to do. Carl wasn't even supposed to be here. He'd called out sick, hadn't he? But his voice had sounded so real, so desperate, that I couldn't just ignore it. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway. The third floor was completely silent. Even the whispers were gone now, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating stillness. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and every step I took felt like it echoed forever. When I reached Lila's room, her laughter had stopped. The window in her door was fogged up, but I could see her silhouette sitting on the bed, perfectly still. I thought about opening the door, about asking her what the hell was going on, but something told me not to. Instead, I kept moving, following the faint hum of the emergency generator. At the end of the hallway, I found the stairs leading up to the roof. The door was slightly open, and the icy wind from outside was blowing in, carrying with it the faint smell of burnt wood. I hesitated, my hand on the railing, listening for any sign of Carl, but there was nothing. And then, from above, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. I don't know why I kept going. Maybe it was the hope that Carl was up there, alive and in need of help. Or maybe it was something else, something I couldn't explain, pulling me forward against my will. When I reached the top of the stairs, I pushed the door open and stepped out onto the roof. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with mist, and the only light came from the dim glow of the generator. The roof was empty, except for a figure standing near the edge. It was Carl, or at least it looked like Carl, but as I moved closer, I realized something was wrong. His back was to me, but his posture was all wrong. His shoulders hunched, his head drooping at that same unnatural angle. And when he turned around, I saw that his eyes were gone, replaced by empty black voids. He'd smiled, wide and unnatural, and spoke in a voice that wasn't his own. "They're already inside, Claire." And then he stepped backward, off the edge of the roof, disappearing into the mist below. I stood there on the roof, staring into the mist where Carl, or whatever that thing was pretending to be Carl, had disappeared. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my body unwilling to move. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything, but I just stood there, frozen. The generator buzzed behind me, its weak light flickering in the haze. I kept telling myself that what I saw wasn't real, that Carl was at home, sick, and not lying shattered at the base of the building. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with this place, with the patients, with me. The shadows I'd seen, the whispers, the figure in the hallway, it all felt connected, like I'd been pulled into something much bigger than I could understand. Finally, my body caught up with my brain, and I forced myself to turn back toward the door. I had to get out of there, find the guards, or at least figure out why none of them were answering their radios. I stumbled down the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, like the air was thickening around me. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, I was gasping for breath, the cold seeping deep into my bones. The hallway was different now. It was darker, the shadows longer, more pronounced, and they seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, faintly and irregularly, as if the building was alive, breathing. I tried the walkie-talkie again, my voice trembling. "Security? Is anyone there? Please, I need help." Static. Then faintly, a voice. Too late. It wasn't Carl. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was deep, distorted, layered with an unnatural echo that made my skin crawl. The walkie-talkie cut off before I could respond, leaving me alone with the silence and the distant sound of something dripping. A slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo louder the more I focused on it. I started walking, flashlight trembling in my grip. The dripping noise grew louder as I approached Lila's room. Her door was still locked, but the window was smeared with something dark, like handprints. My stomach churned as I leaned closer to look. It wasn't rainwater. It was thick, black, and tar-like, oozing down the glass in streaks. "Lila!" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The door rattled, not like someone knocking or hitting it. This was violent, aggressive, like something was trying to break it down from the inside. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, as the door buckled and groaned under the strain. Whatever was behind it wasn't human. It couldn't be. I turned and ran. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls bending and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The lights overhead flickered violently, plunging me into brief intervals of total darkness. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look at the shadows flickering along the edges of my vision. I could feel them watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. As I neared the nurse's station, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. One of the guards was lying on the floor, face down in a pool of blood. His uniform was shredded, and his arms were twisted behind his back at unnatural angles. I didn't want to get closer, but I forced myself to check for a pulse. His skin was ice cold, and his face, God, his face. His mouth was stretched open in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror. But the worst part was his neck. It was bent backward, snapped clean in half, the same angle I'd seen with the others. I stumbled away, gagging. I couldn't do this. I wasn't trained for this. I was a nurse, not a soldier or a detective. Whatever was happening here, it was way beyond me. But I couldn't leave, not without making sure the other patients were safe. I decided to check the security office. It was on the first floor, near the staff break room, and if anyone was still alive, they'd likely be there. I forced myself to keep moving, stepping over the guard's body and heading for the stairs. The dripping noise was louder now, echoing through the building like a heartbeat. I tried not to think about where it was coming from. The first floor was worse than the third. The walls were covered in more of that black tar-like substance, oozing down in thick, slow streams. The air smelled like burnt wood and rotting meat, and the floors were slick beneath my shoes. The dim emergency lights cast strange, angular shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as I walked past. When I reached the security office, the door was slightly open. The monitor screens inside were flickering, showing distorted images of the hallways and patient rooms. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room for any signs of life. The two remaining guards were slumped in their chairs, their heads lolling to the side. I rushed to check their pulses, but I already knew it was too late. Their necks were bent at the same impossible angle, their mouths twisted into those grotesque, silent screams. The walkie-talkies on their belts crackled faintly, but I didn't dare touch them. The security footage was worse. The third-floor hallway was empty now, but the shadows were more pronounced, writhing and shifting like living things. In Lila's room, the black ooze was spreading, dripping from the walls and pooling on the floor. And in the main hallway, near the nurse's station, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure from before, the tall, thin man with the hollow eyes, was standing there, perfectly still. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking directly at me. The screen flickered, and he was gone. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screens, paralyzed by fear. The building felt alive around me, groaning and creaking, like it was aware of me, like it was closing in. I wanted to run, to leave, and never look back, but I couldn't abandon the patients, even if they weren't really patients, even if this place was as messed up as the dark web post said. I couldn't just leave them to whatever this was. I forced myself to leave the security office, clutching the flashlight like it was some kind of lifeline. The hallways were quieter now, the dripping noise replaced by a faint hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows didn't just move now, they reached, their edges stretching toward me like grasping hands. When I passed the break room, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, faint but unmistakable. Claire. It wasn't Carl. It wasn't any of the guards or patients. It was my own voice. I didn't stop to investigate. I ran, heading for the emergency exit at the back of the building. But when I reached it, the door wouldn't budge. The handle was ice cold, and no matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't open. It was like the building was keeping me here, trapping me inside. And then, behind me, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. But I knew without a doubt that if I did, I would see him. The man, the thing, whatever it was. I felt his presence, cold and suffocating, like a shadow that had weight. He whispered my name again, and the lights went out. When the lights went out, I lost all sense of direction. The flashlight was useless. Its beam barely cut through the pitch-black darkness. The air was colder now, heavy and wet, like I was breathing in the same oily blackness that coated the walls upstairs. My ears rang with the deafening silence, broken only by the sound of my own panicked breaths. The footsteps behind me were slow and deliberate, but I still couldn't bring myself to turn around. Whatever was following me wasn't human. I knew that much. Its presence felt wrong, like it wasn't just there in the hallway with me, but everywhere, surrounding me, inside me. I pressed forward, my fingers trailing along the walls to guide me. The sticky residue clung to my skin, cold and viscous. My legs felt heavier with each step, as if the building itself was trying to root me in place. I kept moving, whispering under my breath, "This isn't real. This isn't real." But it didn't help. The hallway didn't end where it should have. I'd walked this route 100 times during my shifts, but the clinic had changed. The walls seemed to stretch and warp, the corners folding in on themselves like some kind of living labyrinth. No matter how far I went, I couldn't find the emergency exit or the stairs back to the 3rd floor. The hallway just kept going, endlessly looping back on itself. And then I saw it, a door that shouldn't have been there. It was massive and ancient, made of warped wood and iron hinges that looked rusted with age. Black tar seeped from its edges, pooling on the floor in thick, sticky puddles. The air around it was cold, colder than the rest of the building, and I could feel a faint vibration in the floor, like something was pulsing behind it. I didn't want to go near it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run in the opposite direction, but I couldn't. My feet moved on their own, dragging me closer and closer until I was standing right in front of it. The air was suffocating now, the vibration stronger, like a heartbeat. My hand reached for the handle, slick with black ooze, and before I could stop myself, I opened the door. The room beyond wasn't part of the clinic. It couldn't be. The walls were made of jagged dark stone, glistening with moisture. The ceiling arched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of water that rippled as I stepped inside. The heartbeat-like vibration was louder here, almost deafening, and the air smelled of sulfur and decay. In the center of the room was a massive pit, perfectly round and filled with a swirling black liquid that shimmered like oil under the faint light coming from nowhere. The walls of the pit were inscribed with symbols I didn't recognize, sharp, angular shapes that seemed to move and shift when I looked at them too long. And then I saw them. Figures stood around the pit, their backs to me, shrouded in darkness. There were dozens of them, maybe more, their bodies unnaturally still. They were tall and thin, their limbs too long, their heads tilted at those impossible angles. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel their attention on me, like they were waiting for me to do something. I wanted to run, but my body refused to listen. My legs carried me closer to the pit, the water rippling under my feet. The figures didn't react, but the air grew heavier, colder, as I approached the edge. The black liquid inside the pit churned, forming shapes, faces, hands, things I couldn't comprehend. It whispered to me, dozens of voices speaking in unison, saying things I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. And then one of the figures turned around, It was Lila, or at least it looked like her. Her skin was pale and waxy, her eyes completely black, and her mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. She didn't blink, didn't breathe, just stared at me with that grotesque, frozen expression. When she spoke, it wasn't her voice. It was layered, deep, and guttural, like 1,000 voices speaking through her. "Welcome, Claire." The black liquid surged, spilling over the edge of the pit and crawling toward me like a living thing. It wrapped around my ankles, cold and viscous, and I could feel it seeping into my skin, burning as it spread. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figures around the pit began to move, their bodies jerking and twisting like broken marionettes. They surrounded me, their empty eyes fixed on mine, and I felt the weight of their presence pressing down on me, suffocating. I tried to pull away, but the black liquid held me in place, pulling me closer to the pit. "Join us," Leela said, her voice echoing in my head. "You've seen too much. You've opened the door. You belong to us now." The liquid was up to my knees, pulling me closer and closer to the edge. The faces in the pit stared up at me, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes full of despair. I could feel them reaching for me, pulling me down into the darkness. And then everything stopped. The lights came back on. I was lying on the floor of the hallway, my clothes soaked with cold water. The door to the strange room was gone, replaced by the plain, featureless wall I'd seen 1,000 times before. The black tar was gone, the air was warm, and the clinic was silent. But I wasn't alone. Lila stood at the end of the hallway, watching me. Her eyes were normal again, blue, bright, and piercing, but her smile was the same. Wide, unnatural, knowing. "They'll be back," she said softly, her voice almost gentle. "And so will you." I don't remember leaving the clinic. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, driving away as fast as I could. The rain had stopped, and the sun was rising over the horizon, but the warmth of the daylight didn't reach me. I felt cold, empty, like something had been taken from me. I quit the job that morning. I didn't explain why. I didn't even bother to give notice. I packed up my things and moved out of my apartment within the week, leaving behind everything I couldn't carry. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my family, but it didn't help. Every night, I hear the whispers. Every night, I dream of the pit, the black liquid, and the figures with their hollow eyes. And every night, I wake up with the feeling that I'm not alone. I've tried to forget, tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but deep down, I know the truth. They're still watching, and they're waiting for me to come back. I was paid to guard an old mansion for a dark web client. The basement door is chained from the inside. Hey everyone, long-time lurker here, but I've never actually posted before. I'm mostly here to read other people's weird stories and remind myself that maybe my life isn't that crazy. Well, that changed a few months ago. What happened to me has been eating at me since, and I just need to get it out. Maybe someone here can tell me what the hell I stumbled into. So, I've been broke for a while. Like, eating ramen 3 times a day kind of broke. My job at the time wasn't cutting it, and rent was creeping up on me faster than I could keep up. I was desperate for anything that paid, which is why I started poking around on some, let's call them less conventional corners of the internet. Now, I'm not proud of it, but I ended up on a forum that looked like a Craigslist for the deep web. You know, the kind of place where you could hire someone to handle problems, or by sketchy electronics with no questions asked. I was just looking for a gig, something short-term, no skills required, and preferably cash up front. That's when I saw the ad. It was super vague, just a few sentences. Looking for a night guard, old property, no experience needed, $2,000 per night, text for details. $2,000 a night? That was insane. The username attached to the post was something generic, like Night Watch Employer, and they had no reviews or history on the forum. Huge red flag, I know, but desperation makes you ignore common sense. I figured the worst case scenario was some sketchy rich guy who wanted me to guard his mansion while he partied in Ibiza or whatever. So, I texted the number listed. The reply came within seconds. Available tonight. No questions asked. Can start immediately. Are you interested? Looking back, that should have been my second red flag. I asked where the job was, and they sent me an address about 30 miles outside the city. I looked it up on Google Maps. It was this massive, isolated property surrounded by woods. Perfect spot for a horror movie. But at the time, I was too busy imagining what I'd do with $2,000 to care. After a bit of back and forth, they Venmo'd me half the money up front. 5 minutes later, there was $1,000 sitting in my account. At this point, any lingering doubts I had were shoved to the back of my mind. I grabbed my backpack, threw in a flashlight, some snacks, and my phone charger, and headed out. The drive to the mansion was unsettling. It was one of those areas where the GPS kept cutting out, and the last 15 minutes were on this narrow, overgrown dirt road. The closer I got, the darker it felt, like the trees themselves were closing in on me. There were no streetlights, no other cars, just my headlights cutting through the pitch black. When I finally pulled up to the mansion, my first thought was, what the hell am I doing here? The place was massive, but falling apart. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. Broken windows, ivy crawling up the walls, a rusty iron gate that creaked like something out of a haunted house. The kind of place you see in those ghost hunter shows, except I was here alone, with no camera crew and no backup. I parked my car, grabbed my stuff, and approached the front door. Before I could knock, I noticed an envelope taped to it, with my name scribbled on the front. Inside was an old-fashioned brass key and a handwritten note that just said, "Stay inside. No matter what. Basement is off limits." That was it. No instructions, no explanation. I figured whoever hired me would show up at some point to explain the rules, so I shrugged it off and went inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. The air was damp, heavy, and reeked of mildew. The floorboards groaned under my feet, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, but oddly enough, the furniture was all still there. It was like someone had just up and left one day and never came back. I set up camp in the main living room, which had a massive fireplace and this creepy, oversized portrait of a man staring down at me from above the mantel. His eyes seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. It gave me the chills, but I tried to laugh it off. Classic old mansion vibes, right? For the first couple of hours, everything was quiet. I walked around to get a feel for the place, checked the locks on the doors and windows, and settled in with some podcasts to pass the time. Around midnight, though, things started to feel off. It began with noises, faint at first, just the sound of creaking floorboards upstairs. I assumed it was the house settling. But then I heard something that made my stomach drop. It wasn't random creaking anymore. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth directly above me. I froze. My first thought was that someone else was in the house. Maybe the person who hired me was doing some kind of test to see if I'd stay put. I shouted up the stairs. "Hello? Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was my own breathing. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it, I heard something else. This time, it came from the basement. A low, metallic clinking noise, like chains being dragged across concrete. I remembered the note. Basement is off limits. I tried to ignore it, but the noise kept going, steady and rhythmic, like someone down there was pulling something heavy across the floor. My curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the basement door, which was at the end of a narrow hallway. When I got there, I noticed something strange. The door wasn't just locked, it was chained from the inside. Thick, rusted chains looped through the handles, with a padlock keeping them in place. But here's the thing. If the chains were on the inside, how were they locked? And more importantly, who or what was making that noise? That's where I'll leave it for now. Trust me, things get way worse. If you're interested, I can post the next part soon. Let me know what you think. Am I crazy, or did I stumble into something way bigger than I realized? The clinking sound from the basement wasn't stopping. It was steady, rhythmic, almost methodical, like someone dragging chains back and forth over concrete. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the basement door, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. My brain was doing that thing where it runs through every possible explanation except the one you don't want to believe. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of animal, a raccoon, a stray dog, something that got stuck down there and was bumping into stuff. But the way the chains moved, the pacing of it, felt too deliberate, too human. And that's when the panic set in. I took a step closer to the door, trying to keep my breathing under control. The flashlight in my hand was trembling, casting jittery beams of light on the cracked wallpaper. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a second before I remembered the chains. It was locked, and from what I could tell, there was no way to open it from this side. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. The chain noise stopped. Then there was a sound that made my blood run cold. A single knock, not on the floor or the walls, but on the other side of the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I stumbled back so fast I nearly fell. My flashlight hit the floor, and the beam spun wildly around the hallway, like something out of a found footage horror movie. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to grab my stuff and leave. But here's the thing. My car was parked nearly half a mile down that overgrown dirt road. If whoever, or whatever, was in the basement decided to follow me, I wouldn't make it. I didn't even have cell service out here to call for help. I convinced myself to go back to the living room. Maybe I could wait it out until morning, then collect the rest of my money and never come back. It was just one night, right? I could handle this. I grabbed my flashlight, steadied my breathing, and walked back down the hall. But as I reached the end of it, I realized something was different. The portrait above the fireplace, the creepy one with the guy who looked like he was staring straight into your soul, had shifted. It was subtle, but I swear his head was tilted slightly to the side, like he was looking at me from a different angle. I froze. I hadn't touched it. and there was no one else in the house. At least, there shouldn't have been. My eyes scanned the room, half expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows, but everything was still. Too still. I couldn't take my eyes off the portrait. It felt like if I looked away, something terrible would happen. The man's expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes, like he knew something I didn't. Something about the way he stared made my skin crawl, and I swear the longer I looked, the more his expression seemed to change. Just barely, but enough to make me doubt my own senses. I don't know how long I stood there, but a sudden noise snapped me out of it. A loud bang from upstairs. My first instinct was to grab my bag and bolt, but again, I had nowhere to go. I told myself it was probably just something falling over, maybe an old piece of furniture shifting. It was an ancient house, after all. But when I started up the stairs to check, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Muddy footprints on the wooden stairs. They weren't mine. They were too large, for one thing, and the shape was wrong. Like whoever made them was barefoot, but their toes were longer than they should have been, almost claw-like. The prints were wet, leading up the stairs and disappearing into the darkness above. My flashlight flickered as I aimed it toward the second floor. Of course, because when you're in a creepy house in the middle of nowhere, your flashlight has to start dying. That's just the rule, right? I crept upstairs, each step groaning under my weight. The air felt heavier up here, thick with dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. A metallic tang that made my throat tighten. There were 3 doors at the top of the stairs, all slightly ajar. My flashlight beam swept across them one by one, but the hallway seemed empty. The first door led to a bedroom. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the bed was framed with wrought iron that looked like it belonged in some Victorian asylum. Nothing moved. The second door opened into what must have been a study. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books so old their spines were crumbling. A desk sat in the center of the room, cluttered with papers and what looked like a broken oil lamp. But it was the third door that caught my attention. It led to a bathroom, and the muddy footprints stopped just inside the doorway. I hesitated, flashlight shaking as I stepped closer. The bathroom was small and claustrophobic, with cracked tiles and a clawfoot tub in the corner. The footprints ended at the tub, and my heart sank as I realized why. The shower curtain was closed. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around and leave. But something, curiosity, fear, or maybe just sheer stupidity, kept me rooted in place. My hand reached out before I could stop myself, fingers brushing against the grimy fabric of the curtain. I yanked it back. The tub was empty. For a moment, relief flooded through me, until I noticed the writing on the mirror. It was faint, like someone had traced it into the fog that had lingered after a hot shower, except there hadn't been a hot shower. The words read, "It's not yours to take." I don't know how I didn't lose it right there. My instincts took over, and I bolted out of the bathroom, nearly tripping over myself in the process. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard something that stopped me cold. The chains in the basement had started moving again, but this time, they weren't dragging. They were rattling, violently, like something or someone was trying to break free. And then, for the first time, I heard a voice, low, guttural, and echoing faintly from below. "Help me." It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I leave? but the thought of going back down that dirt road in the pitch dark felt just as dangerous as staying in the house. I ended up barricading myself in the living room, dragging an old armchair against the door and clutching my flashlight like it was a weapon. I kept my eyes on the portrait above the fireplace, convinced it was watching me. The rattling downstairs stopped after a while, but as the silence stretched on, I realized something else was wrong. The air had changed. It felt colder, sharper, and then I heard it. Breathing, not mine, coming from the hallway. The breathing wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone trying to remain calm while standing just out of sight. My grip on the flashlight tightened, my knuckles going white as I forced myself to stay silent. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, not to give away that I'd heard it. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in as my eyes locked onto the doorway. The hallway beyond was swallowed in shadows, but I could feel it. Something was out there, just beyond the light's reach. I don't know if it was the paranoia or my senses heightening, but I swear I could feel it watching me. I edged back toward the fireplace, my sneakers scuffing against the worn floorboards. The sound was loud in the suffocating silence, and as soon as I moved, the breathing stopped. My heart hammered in my chest. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen, but there was nothing. Just silence. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting alongside me. And then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't breathing. It was whispering. It started faintly, almost like wind slipping through cracks in the walls. But as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't just random noise. It was words. A voice, or maybe voices, murmuring just low enough that I couldn't make out what they were saying. I shone my flashlight toward the hallway, but it only illuminated a few feet ahead before the beam was swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but the whispers continued, moving, shifting, sometimes close, sometimes distant, like they were circling me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. I hated how weak it sounded, but I couldn't help it. "I'm not playing games. Show yourself." The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint hum of my own flashlight and the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. Then, from the hallway, came a sound I'll never forget. It was laughter. It wasn't normal laughter. It was wrong, distorted, like it was being played backward on a tape recorder. It didn't sound human. It was high-pitched and grating, echoing off the walls and filling the entire house. My flashlight flickered again, and I felt the first real stab of terror. I don't know what came over me, but I bolted toward the front door. I didn't care about the money anymore. I didn't even care if my car was miles away in the dark. I just needed to get out. But when I reached the door, I stopped cold. The envelope with my name on it was still taped to the door, but the key inside was gone. I swear I'd left it in my pocket. I frantically checked, patting myself down, searching the floor, the nearby furniture, but it was nowhere to be found. My pulse was racing as I pulled on the door handle, yanking it with all my strength. It didn't budge. It wasn't just locked. It was like it had been fused shut. That's when I heard the floorboards creak behind me. It was soft at first, like someone testing their weight. Then another creak, and another, each one closer than the last. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I aimed it at the living room. At first, I didn't see anything. The beam swept over the dusty furniture, the peeling wallpaper, the gaping hallway, leading to the basement door. Everything looked the same as before. But then I noticed the portrait. The man in the painting wasn't looking at me anymore. His head was tilted down now, his eyes locked on something near the floor, something just out of view. I stepped back, my flashlight flickering as I raised it higher to get a better look. That's when I saw it. A hand. It was sticking out from the shadows of the hallway, just barely visible in the weak light, pale, with long bony fingers that ended in cracked, jagged nails. The hand twitched once, then curled around the edge of the wall like it was pulling someone, forward. The rest of it emerged slowly, agonizingly slow, like it was savoring the moment. The figure was hunched, its limbs too long for its body, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and its face, God, its face was covered in some kind of cloth or burlap sack, tied tightly around the neck. It stopped just at the edge of the hallway, its head twitching from side to side as if it was sniffing the air. The whispers started again, low and guttural, but this time they were coming from inside the figure. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam catching its empty sockets beneath the cloth. That was all it took. I bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping over myself as I sprinted toward the second floor. I don't know why I thought going upstairs was a good idea. Maybe I figured I could barricade myself in one of the rooms or find a window to climb out of. Either way, I didn't have a plan. I was running on pure adrenaline. The first door I tried was the study. I slammed it shut behind me and shoved the desk against it, my hand shaking so badly I could barely move it. The room was dead silent now, the only sound my ragged breathing. I turned to face the room, shining the flashlight around in quick, jerky movements. The bookshelves, the papers on the desk, the broken oil lamp, everything looked the same as before. But something felt wrong. I realized what it was when I looked at the floor. There were muddy footprints again, but this time they didn't lead into the room. They led out. The desk behind me groaned suddenly, like something was pressing against it from the other side. My heart leapt into my throat as I backed away, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. The whispers were back, louder now, and accompanied by a sound that made my stomach churn. Scratching. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more frantic, like nails dragging against wood. Whatever was on the other side of the door wasn't trying to break it down, it was trying to dig through it. And then it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, waiting for the next sound. It didn't come from the door this time. It came from behind me. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming not to look. The beam of my flashlight swept across the bookshelves, the cluttered desk, the shattered oil lamp, until it landed on the mirror. There was writing on it again. Downstairs. And in the reflection, just over my shoulder, I saw the door to the study swing open. The study door creaked open behind me, and I froze. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my brain was stuck in a loop of run, 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 but I couldn't make myself move. All I could do was stare at the mirror. The writing, downstairs, was clear as day now, even though the glass was cracked and fogged with dust. But what really got me was the reflection. In it, the study door swung wider, and someone stepped inside. The flashlight beam didn't catch them directly, but I could see the outline of a figure standing in the doorway, tall and impossibly thin, their head tilted at an unnatural angle. I turned around just in time to see the figure vanish into the shadows. The whispers came back, louder this time, echoing through the study. They weren't just in my ears anymore. They were in my head, like they were drilling straight into my thoughts. I staggered backward, clutching my flashlight, like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Then the door slammed shut. The sound of it jolted me out of my daze, and instinct kicked in. I shoved the desk aside, my heart pounding, and flung the door open. The hallway was empty. The whispers had stopped. Everything was still, but it didn't feel right. The air was colder now, sharp and biting against my skin, and the shadows seemed darker than before, like the light was struggling to push them back. I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight sweeping left and right. The other rooms were just as I'd left them, silent, untouched. But the footprints were back. They were smeared and uneven now, like whoever or whatever had made them was dragging their feet. They led toward the staircase, and I knew deep down where they were headed. The basement. I didn't want to go back downstairs. Every fiber of my being told me to stay put, barricade myself in one of the rooms, and wait for sunrise. But something about the house wouldn't let me. It was like the whispers had gotten inside me, planting a thought that wasn't mine. You need to see. You need to know. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the empty house. The flashlight beam jittered with every movement, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the air felt heavier. The living room was as I'd left it, the armchair still pushed against the door. The portrait above the fireplace, though, had changed again. The man's face was twisted now, his expression contorted into something that looked like a mix of anger and despair. His eyes weren't just watching me anymore. They were following me. But I couldn't focus on that for long, because the noise had started again. The chains in the basement were rattling, louder than ever, accompanied by that low, guttural voice. Help me. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. The basement door was still chained from the inside, the padlock rusted and unmoving. But now there was something else. Deep gouges had appeared in the wood, like someone or something had been clawing at it from the other side. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door. My brain was screaming at me to stop, to turn around and leave, but my body wasn't listening. Before I could think better of it, I raised the flashlight and slammed it against the padlock. Once, twice. The metal cracked on the third hit, and the chain slid loose, clattering to the floor. The door creaked open, and a wave of cold air hit me, so sharp it felt like knives against my skin. The staircase leading down was steep and narrow. The wood rotted and splintered. I hesitated at the top, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The basement was bigger than I'd expected, the beam barely reaching the far wall. It was cluttered with old furniture, broken crates, and what looked like the remains of some kind of workshop. Tools scattered on a workbench, a rusted vice grip bolted to the surface. But in the middle of the room, there was something else. A figure. It was slumped against the far wall, wrapped in chains that glinted dully in the flashlight's glow. At first, I thought it was a mannequin. Its skin was pale and waxy, and its head lolled at an unnatural angle. But then it moved. Just a small twitch, but enough to send me stumbling backward. The figure raised its head slowly, and I realized it wasn't just wrapped in chains. It was tied to the wall. the metal cutting into its flesh. Its face was partially obscured by a burlap sack, but through the gaps I could see its eyes. They weren't human. They were dark, empty pits, and yet they seemed to burn with an intensity that pinned me in place. "Help me," it said again, but the voice wasn't coming from its mouth. It was echoing all around me, filling the room like it was part of the air itself. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure strained against the chains, its limbs jerking unnaturally. "They took it," it hissed, the voice sharp and distorted. "It's not yours. You can't keep it." I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure's head snapped toward me, and for the first time, I saw its teeth, jagged and too many, like shards of broken glass jammed into its gums. "Leave," it growled, the word reverberating through the basement. "Leave before they come back." I don't know what happened next. One moment, I was frozen, staring at the figure as it writhed against the chains. The next, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into total darkness. The whispers came back, louder than ever, swirling around me in a chaotic storm of noise. I could feel something moving in the dark, brushing past me, breathing down my neck. I stumbled backward, my hands groping for the staircase, but the space felt wrong. Bigger, endless, like the basement had stretched into something much larger than it should have been. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the whispers stopped. The flashlight sputtered back to life, and I found myself at the foot of the stairs, the basement door wide open behind me. The figure was gone. I didn't wait to see what else might happen. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me and piling whatever I could find in front of it. The living room was ice cold now, and the portrait above the fireplace had changed one last time. The man wasn't in it anymore. The canvas was empty, save for the words scrawled across it in black paint. "You shouldn't have come." I stared at the empty canvas above the fireplace. The words, "You shouldn't have come," dripping like fresh blood. My breath caught in my throat. The room felt alive now, like the house itself had been waiting for this moment, like it had finally woken up. I needed to get out. The barricade over the basement door wasn't enough. I wasn't sure anything would be enough. My eyes darted to the front door. It was still shut tight, no key in sight, but I wasn't going to waste time searching. I figured there had to be another way out. A window, a back door, anything. I grabbed my flashlight and made a run for the kitchen. It was at the far end of the house, and I hadn't bothered checking it earlier, but now it felt like my only chance. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have, the sound bouncing back at me like the house was mocking my every move. The kitchen was as decrepit as the rest of the place. Old appliances covered in grime, a sink filled with stagnant water, and cobwebs thick enough to choke on. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the light from my flashlight barely penetrated the gloom. But there, at the far end, I saw a door. I rushed toward it, my hands fumbling at the knob. It turned, but when I pulled, it didn't budge. Something heavy was blocking it from the other side. I pressed my ear against the wood, hoping to hear what it might be, and immediately wished I hadn't. There was a noise on the other side, scraping, like nails or claws, dragging across the floor. Then came the whispers again, faint but distinct. "You can't leave. You're part of it now." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The beam swung wildly, landing on a small table in the corner. At first, I thought it was covered in old dishes, but as I got closer, I realized the truth. It was bones. Not human, I think, but something close. Too close. They were laid out in a deliberate pattern, like some kind of offering or warning. A symbol had been carved into the table beneath them, jagged and crude, but unmistakable. It looked like an eye, surrounded by a web of lines and circles. My stomach turned, but I didn't have time to think. The scraping behind the door grew louder, more frantic. Whatever was on the other side wanted in. I backed out of the kitchen, my flashlight flickering again. The house felt alive now, groaning and shifting like it was breathing around me. The shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own, stretching and twisting into shapes that made my skin crawl. I needed a new plan. The stairs. I'd seen a window at the end of the upstairs hallway earlier. If I could break it and climb down, maybe I'd have a shot. I sprinted for the staircase, but halfway there, the air turned ice cold, freezing my breath in my throat. I stopped dead, my flashlight beam catching something in the doorway to the living room. The figure was back. It stood motionless in the doorway, its head cocked to one side, the burlap sack still tied tightly around its face. But now, the sack was soaked with something dark, and the smell of iron filled the room. I didn't wait for it to move. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my hand gripping the railing so hard I thought it might snap. The whispers followed me, louder than ever, overlapping and echoing until they were all I could hear. When I reached the top, the window was right where I remembered it, but as I raised the flashlight, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a window anymore. The glass was gone, replaced by solid brick. No, 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 I muttered, running my hands over the wall. It was real, solid, like it had always been that way. Behind me, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long now, the doors lining it multiplying until it seemed endless. And at the far end, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, all hunched and misshapen, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their faces hidden behind burlap sacks. They stood perfectly still, but I knew they were watching me. Then, as one, they took a step forward. I ran. It didn't matter where. I just ran, throwing open doors and slamming them shut behind me. The house was a maze now, the room shifting and changing with every turn. One moment I was in a bedroom, the next a storage closet, then a hallway I didn't recognize. The whispers were everywhere, overlapping in a maddening chorus. It's not yours. It's not yours. You can't leave. You're part of it now. Finally, I stumbled into a room that felt different. It was small and bare, with nothing but a single chair in the center. On the chair was a key. The key. It was the same old-fashioned brass key from the envelope, the one that had disappeared. I didn't question it. I grabbed the key and bolted out of the room, hoping to God it would work on the front door. The house seemed to resist me now, the walls groaning and closing in, the whispers growing louder with every step. When I reached the living room, the figure was there again, standing in front of the fireplace. But this time, it wasn't alone. The portrait had changed again. The man was back, but his face was twisted in a scream, his eyes wide with terror. And standing behind him were the figures from the hallway, their hands on his shoulders, dragging him down into the canvas. The figure in the room tilted its head, its voice cutting through the chaos. You were never meant to leave. I didn't wait. I shoved the key into the lock, my hand shaking so badly I could barely turn it. The door creaked open, and I threw myself outside, stumbling into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. When I finally dared to look back, the mansion was gone. The dirt road stretched into the darkness, empty and silent. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, starting the car and tearing down the road as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in the safety of the city. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't really escape, that somehow part of me is still in that house. And every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers, "It's not yours." And I wonder, what did they mean? What did I take? I'm a geologist, working on a private project. The dark web claims we've uncovered an ancient prison. Last night, I heard something knocking from beneath the rock. Alright, so I wasn't going to show this. Honestly, I feel kind of stupid even typing it out. But after what happened last night, I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone here can help me make sense of it. I don't know. It's just weird. So, I'm a geologist, and I've been doing this job for about 8 years now. Most of the time, it's pretty mundane, analyzing rock samples, writing up reports, the usual. A couple of months ago, I got a call from this private company. I can't name them for obvious reasons, so let's just call them X Corp. They were super vague about the details, just saying they needed someone with my expertise for a sensitive project. The pay was insane, like triple my usual rate, so I figured, why not? A few weeks in the middle of nowhere sounded like a good break from the routine. The project site is out in this desert region, miles from the nearest town. When I first got there, it was obvious this wasn't a normal gig. The security was intense. Armed guards, clearance badges, the whole works. The main area is a fenced-off dig site, surrounded by prefab trailers and equipment. They told me they'd discovered a subterranean anomaly and needed me to analyze the surrounding rock layers. It wasn't just me on the team. There were archaeologists, engineers, even some military-looking guys who didn't talk much. Everyone seemed a little on edge, but I figured it was just the high stakes. Private projects like this tend to be hush-hush, so I didn't think too much of it. Then, a few days in, things started getting strange. We were working on a section about 200 feet down when one of the archaeologists, Dr. Patel, uncovered something odd. It looked like some kind of ancient carving, a pattern etched into the rock face. It didn't match anything natural, and it wasn't consistent with any known civilization in the area. The carvings were geometric, almost mechanical, but weathered to the point where you could barely make out the details. Patel was thrilled. She called it an unprecedented find and started documenting everything. Meanwhile, I focused on the geological side of things. The deeper we dug, the weirder the rock formations became. There were layers that didn't match the region's history, rocks that looked like they'd been exposed to extreme heat, others that seemed almost fused together. And then there were the noises. At first I thought it was just the equipment, hydraulic drills, the ventilation system, that kind of stuff. But no, this was different. It was faint, like a low hum or vibration, just barely audible. Sometimes it sounded almost like knocking. I didn't say anything because I figured it was my imagination, or maybe some weird acoustic effect from the rock layers. But over the next few days, the knocking got louder. Last week, things escalated. One of the guards, let's call him Ramirez, came into the trailer looking pale as a sheet. He said he'd been doing a perimeter check when he heard someone whispering his name. He swore he was alone out there. The desert at night is eerily quiet, so any noise sticks out. But the idea of someone knowing his name freaked him out. The higher-ups told him to keep quiet about it, but word spread fast. People started reporting strange things. Equipment malfunctioning, shadows moving where they shouldn't be. One guy even claimed he saw something crawling near the edge of the site, but when they checked, there was nothing there. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't spooked, but I tried to stay rational. Science is all about finding explanations, right? Still, there was this growing tension in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Last night, it finally did. I was in the main trailer finishing up some data logs when I heard it, the knocking, louder than ever before. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was pounding on the rock with their fist. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but when I stepped out, the night was still. No wind, no animals, nothing. The knocking was coming from beneath my feet. I ran to get Patel and a couple of the others. By the time we got back to the spot, it had stopped, but we all agreed to check it out in the morning. This morning, they sent down a camera drone to survey the area below the dig site. The feed cut out after about 30 seconds. Before it did, though, we caught a glimpse of something. It wasn't rock. It looked like a surface, polished, black, and covered in the same geometric carvings we'd found earlier. Patel thinks it's a structure, maybe a burial chamber or a temple. But I don't think so. The patterns, they don't feel human. The worst part, when the drone cut out, there was a split second of audio. It sounded like something heavy, dragging across stone. And then, clear as day, I swear I heard it. 3 knocks. Okay, I'll stop here for now. I'll update this post after tonight's briefing. They're sending a team down into the shaft tomorrow, and I've been asked to join. Honestly, I don't know if I want to. If anyone has any ideas about what we found, or if you've heard of anything like this before, please let me know. This feels wrong. They called the meeting at 7 p.m. sharp. The air in the briefing room was tense. No one was joking around or chatting like they normally would before a big dig. Even the guards were quieter than usual, their hands resting on their holsters, like they expected something to jump out at them. The lead archaeologist, Patel, started the briefing by laying out a series of grainy images taken by the drone before its feed went dark. The black, polished surface we'd seen wasn't a fluke. It stretched out for at least several meters, curving slightly before disappearing into shadow. Patel had already nicknamed it the monolith, but no one laughed at her little joke. There was something off about those images, though, something that didn't hit me until later. The carvings, the geometric patterns, they didn't just look like symbols, they looked like they moved. I wasn't the only one who noticed it. "What's up with the patterns?" someone asked. "They're different in every frame." Patel brushed it off, saying it was probably just the angle of the drone's light or a trick of the shadows, but I could tell she didn't believe it. Her hands were shaking as she flipped through the slides. Then the project director, a tall, cold guy who everyone called Mr. Black, stood up. He announced that a team would be sent down at dawn to investigate the monolith directly. He didn't ask for volunteers. He just started reading names off a clipboard like it was a roll call. My name was second on the list. I didn't say anything. None of us did. But I could feel the room tighten, like everyone was holding their breath. The rest of the night was a blur. I tried to sleep, but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The knocking. Not faint and distant like before, but loud, insistent, impossible to ignore. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and went outside to get some air. The desert was cold and eerily silent. Even the insects had stopped making noise. I was staring out at the dig site, trying to calm my nerves when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a trick of the moonlight, but then it moved, slow and deliberate, like it knew I was watching. It was tall, too tall to be human, and the way it shifted was wrong. I blinked, and it was gone. Morning came fast, and before I knew it, I was standing at the edge of the shaft, harness strapped tight, waiting for my turn to descend. There were 5 of us on the team. Me, Patel, Ramirez, the guard who'd heard the whispers, and 2 engineers. The ride down was nerve-wracking. The shaft was narrow and poorly lit, the walls slick with moisture, even though we were in the middle of the desert. The deeper we went, the colder it got. By the time we hit the bottom, I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. And then we saw it. The monolith wasn't just big, it was massive. A towering, curved wall of obsidian-like material, its surface etched with those same shifting patterns. Up close, the carvings looked even stranger. They weren't just etched into the surface, they seemed to pulse, like they were alive. Patel was practically buzzing with excitement, snapping photos and taking measurements. The rest of us hung back, unsure of what to do. Even Ramirez, who was usually the tough guy of the group, looked uneasy. Things started going wrong almost immediately. One of the engineers, a guy named Lee, was setting up some scanning equipment when his headset crackled to life. "Lee, come in," a voice said. The problem, no one had called him. He froze, staring at the rest of us. Who is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. The line went dead. A second later, the lights on his equipment started flickering, then went out completely. "Probably just interference," Patel said, though she didn't sound convinced. But then we heard it again. The knocking. It was louder now, echoing through the chamber, like someone was slamming their fists against the monolith. Ramirez was the first to react. He pulled his sidearm and aimed it at the wall, barking orders for whoever, or whatever, was making the noise to show themselves. "Put that thing away," Patel snapped. "It's just the rock settling." "Rocks don't settle like that," Ramirez shot back. And then, as if to prove his point, the knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then we heard something else. Something worse. A scraping sound, like nails dragging across stone, followed by a low, guttural growl. It seemed to come from inside the monolith, vibrating through the air and into my chest. Patel's face went pale. "That's not possible," she whispered. Lee panicked. He dropped his equipment and bolted for the lift, muttering something about not wanting to end up like the others. "What others?" I shouted after him, but he didn't stop. Before anyone could go after him, the monolith changed. The carvings began to shift, the patterns twisting and warping like they were alive. The surface rippled, and for a split second, I thought I saw something pressing against it from the other side. Something with too many limbs. That's when the lights went out. Total darkness. The kind where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I heard someone, maybe Ramirez, start cursing, but his voice was drowned out by a deafening roar. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force, shaking the walls and making my ears ring. And then I felt it. A hand. or something like a hand, brushed against my arm. The skin was cold and damp, like it had been buried underground for centuries. I screamed and swung my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the monolith, its carvings glowing faintly in the dark. We managed to get back to the surface, but Lee never made it. The lift operator swore he hadn't seen anyone come up, and there was no sign of him at the bottom of the shaft. Now I'm sitting in my trailer, trying to piece together what just happened. The others are shaken, but trying to act like everything's fine. It's not, because just now, as I was writing this, I heard it again. 3 knocks. This time, they were coming from inside my trailer. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Not after what happened in the shaft. And definitely not after hearing those knocks inside my trailer. I sat there, heart pounding, clutching a flashlight like it was some kind of weapon. The room felt colder than it should have, and no matter how much I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The knocks came again, softer this time, like someone or something was testing me. I swung the flashlight toward the source of the sound. Nothing, just my desk and a stack of geological reports I hadn't touched in weeks. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. When I woke up, the door to my trailer was open. The camp was in chaos when I stepped outside. People were running back and forth, shouting, while guards barked orders to stay calm. It didn't take long to figure out why. More than half the team was missing. Ramirez was one of them. So was Patel. No one saw them leave. Their trailers were empty, their equipment still inside. One guy claimed he heard footsteps in the middle of the night, but when he looked outside, the camp was completely still. Even the director, Mr. Black, seemed rattled, though he did his best to hide it. He called an emergency meeting and ordered a full sweep of the area, but deep down, I think we all knew it wouldn't matter. They were gone, and we weren't going to find them. By midday, the search teams came back empty-handed. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just empty desert stretching out in every direction. That's when the rumors started. One of the engineers swore he'd seen something on the perimeter cameras, something tall and thin, moving just out of range of the floodlights. Another guy, a technician, said he'd been reviewing audio logs from the shaft and heard voices, not just static or interference, but actual voices. They were talking, he said, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. Not in English, though. It sounded ancient. I didn't want to believe him, but part of me couldn't shake the memory of that growl we heard in the shaft, the way it seemed to crawl into my bones. That night, I stayed up again, too scared to close my eyes. The camp felt wrong. The air was heavy, and every little sound made my skin crawl. Around 2 a.m., the power went out. I was sitting at my desk when it happened, staring blankly at a report I wasn't actually reading. 1 second, everything was lit by the harsh fluorescent glow of the overhead lights. The next, I was plunged into total darkness. At first, I thought it was a blown fuse or a generator issue. Stuff like that happens out here all the time. But then I looked out the window. The floodlights around the dig site were still on, casting long, eerie shadows over the equipment. My trailer was the only one without power. That's when I heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Leave," it said. "You don't belong here." I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the door, heart hammering in my chest. The voice came again, louder this time, almost desperate. Leave, before it's too late. And then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my bag, threw in whatever I could carry, and headed straight for the director's trailer. Mr. Black was still awake, sitting at his desk with a stack of documents spread out in front of him. He didn't even look up when I barged in. "We have to shut this down," I said, my voice trembling. "We're in over our heads." He finally looked at me, his expression calm but cold. "You've seen something," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, and for a moment, I thought he might actually listen. But then he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "We can't stop now," he said. "Do you have any idea what we're sitting on?" "I don't care," I snapped. "People are disappearing. Something's wrong down there." He didn't respond, just stared at me with this strange, almost pitying look. "You felt it, haven't you?" he finally said. "The pull. What are you talking about?" "The monolith," he said. "It wants something." I left his trailer more confused and terrified than ever. The way he talked about the monolith, it was like he thought it was alive. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. But when I tried to leave, the guard stopped me. "Orders are to keep everyone on site," one of them said, blocking my path to the vehicles. "Are you kidding me?" I shouted. "People are missing. Don't you get it? We're next." He didn't budge. I went back to my trailer, defeated. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, a new thought began to creep in. What if Mr. Black was right? What if the monolith did want something? And what if it wasn't going to let us leave until it got it? At 4 a.m., the screaming started. It came from the dig site, a high, piercing wail that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside, joining a small group of people gathering near the edge of the shaft. "Who's down there?" someone asked. No one answered. The screaming stopped as suddenly as it started, replaced by a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Then the ground shook. It wasn't like a normal earthquake. This was different. The vibrations were rhythmic, almost like footsteps, growing louder and closer with each passing second. And then we saw it. The monolith was glowing. A faint, pulsating light seeped from its carvings, casting strange, twisting shadows on the walls of the shaft. Someone, one of the engineers, started muttering a prayer. "Shut it down," I shouted. "Whatever we're doing, we have to stop." But no one moved. They were all frozen, staring down into the glowing pit, like moths drawn to a flame. I don't know how long we stood there, paralyzed by fear. Eventually, the rumbling stopped, and the light from the monolith faded, but the damage was done. By morning, 3 more people were gone, including the technician who'd heard the voices on the audio logs. And now, there's something else. Scratches, long, deep gouges etched into the rock around the monolith, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Whatever this thing is, it's waking up, and I don't think we can stop it. By the next morning, the camp was a ghost town in every sense that mattered. The remaining team members barely spoke, sticking to their trailers or wandering around in a daze. Even the guards looked shaken, their usual stoic professionalism replaced by nervous glances at every shadow. We all felt it. The camp wasn't safe anymore. I spent the early hours poring over my notes and trying to make sense of what we'd uncovered. But no matter how many times I went over the data, nothing added up. The geological anomalies, the strange carvings, The inexplicable sounds. It was like we were dealing with something beyond science. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to believe what Mr. Black had said. The monolith wasn't just a structure, it was something more. Around noon, the power went out across the entire site. At first, people thought it was a simple generator failure, but when the backup systems didn't kick in, panic started to set in. Radios were dead, satellite phones wouldn't connect, and even our flashlights flickered like they were fighting to stay on. That's when Mr. Black called another meeting. We gathered in the main trailer, which was dimly lit by a single emergency lantern. He didn't waste any time getting to the point. "We've reached a critical juncture," he said, his voice steady, despite the fear in his eyes. "I know some of you are scared, and I don't blame you, but we can't abandon this site. Not now." "Are you serious?" one of the engineers snapped. "People are disappearing. The equipment's failing. What more do you need to see?" Black didn't flinch. "I understand your concerns, but we've come too far to turn back. We're on the verge of uncovering something extraordinary, something that could change everything. Or kill us all," I muttered, louder than I intended. Black turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You felt it, haven't you? The presence, the power. This isn't just an archaeological find. It's a gateway." "A gateway to what?" I demanded. He didn't answer. After the meeting, I decided to check on the dig site myself. I didn't trust Black, or anyone else at this point. But I needed to know what we were dealing with. The shaft was eerily quiet as I descended, the faint glow of my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The walls seemed to press in closer than before, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of something I couldn't quite place. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The monolith had changed again. Its surface was no longer smooth and reflective. Instead, it was cracked and uneven, like it had been violently forced apart from within. The carvings were brighter now, pulsing with a sickly green light that made my stomach churn. And the scratches, the ones we'd noticed the day before, had multiplied. They weren't just around the monolith anymore. They were everywhere, gouged deep into the walls and floor of the chamber. Something had been here. As I stepped closer, my flashlight flickered and went out. I cursed under my breath, fumbling with the switch, but it was no use. The light was dead. That's when I heard it again, the knocking. It was louder this time, echoing through the chamber like thunder. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, followed by a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then, the voice. "Why? Do you wake us?" It wasn't like any voice I'd ever heard. It was deep and resonant, as if it were coming from everywhere at once. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen in terror. But my legs wouldn't move. "We are not ready." The voice grew louder with each word, shaking the ground beneath my feet. And then the monolith began to split. It started as a hairline crack, running vertically down the center of the structure. But within seconds, the crack widened, revealing a dark void beyond. A foul stench poured out, like rotting meat and sulfur, so strong it made my eyes water. I stumbled backward, barely managing to keep my balance. My flashlight flickered back to life for just a moment, illuminating the darkness inside the monolith. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. It wasn't a void, it was a chamber, a vast pulsating space, filled with something that defied explanation. Shapes moved in the shadows, writhing and twisting like a mass of living nightmares. And then I saw the eyes. They were everywhere, glowing faintly in the darkness, watching me with an intelligence that felt ancient and malevolent. "Leave," the voice boomed again, shaking the walls of the shaft. "Before we rise." I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled back to the lift and hit the controls with shaking hands, praying it would work. The platform jerked to life, and I felt a surge of relief as it began to ascend. But as I looked back down into the shaft, I saw them. Figures, tall, thin, and impossibly fast, climbing the walls like spiders. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, their limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. One of them stopped and looked up at me. Its face, or what passed for a face, was blank and featureless, save for a single glowing eye in the center of its head. And then it smiled. When I reached the surface, I didn't stop running until I was back at my trailer. The camp was in chaos again, people shouting and packing their belongings as fast as they could. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd seen something in the shaft. One of the guards was ranting about shadows moving in the desert, while another claimed he'd seen figures standing at the edge of the floodlights. "We have to go," he kept saying, his voice rising in panic. "We have to go now. I don't know what's going to happen next. Black is still refusing to shut down the project, insisting we're on the brink of a world-changing discovery. But I don't think we're discovering anything. I think we've woken something up, and it's only a matter of time before it comes for us." I woke up to the sound of alarms blaring across the camp. My head was pounding, my heart racing, even before I fully understood what was happening. The smell of burning fuel filled the air, and the faint glow of flames flickered through the window of my trailer. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I threw on my boots and stepped outside into chaos. One of the supply trailers was on fire, thick black smoke curling into the dawn sky. People were running in every direction, shouting at one another, but no one seemed to know what was going on. And then I heard it again. The voice. Too late. It wasn't coming from the shaft this time. It was coming from everywhere. I found Mr. Black near the central hub, barking orders at a group of guards. His usual cold demeanor was gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen before. Fear. "What the hell is happening?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. He shook me off, glaring. "The monolith is destabilizing. The readings are off the charts." "What does that even mean?" "It means," he said, his voice rising, "that whatever's down there is breaking through. We're out of time." Despite everything, he still refused to evacuate. "This is bigger than any of us," he said, pacing back and forth. "Do you have any idea what kind of power we're dealing with? If we can contain it..." "Contain it?" I cut him off. "Are you insane? We can't even comprehend it." But he wouldn't listen. He was too far gone, his obsession with the monolith blinding him to the reality of the situation. That's when the ground started shaking. The tremors were worse than anything we'd felt before. Tents collapsed, equipment toppled over, and a deep, resonant rumble echoed up from the shaft. People started screaming, running toward the vehicles despite the guards' attempts to hold them back. I didn't blame them. Whatever was coming, I didn't want to be here when it arrived. But as I turned to join the exodus, I saw something that stopped me cold. The monolith was glowing again, brighter than ever, and the light was spreading. Cracks had formed around the shaft, radiating outward like spiderwebs, and from those cracks poured an unearthly green mist. The mist moved like it was alive, coiling and twisting through the air, reaching out toward the camp. And then the voices started. They weren't words this time, at least not in any language I could understand. It was more like a chorus, hundreds of overlapping whispers that grew louder and louder until they became an unbearable cacophony. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just in the air, it was in my head, vibrating through my skull, like it was trying to burrow into my brain. And then I saw them, the figures from the shaft. They emerged from the mist, tall and spindly, their featureless faces somehow more terrifying in the daylight. Their movements were jerky, almost insect-like, as they stalked through the camp, their glowing eyes scanning the chaos. One of them stopped and turned toward me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then it raised a hand, or what I think was a hand, and pointed at me. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from those things. The camp was falling apart around me, people screaming and disappearing into the mist. I passed one of the guards lying on the ground, his face twisted in terror, his eyes wide open but unseeing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The monolith wasn't just a gateway, it was a prison, and we just opened the door. Somehow, I ended up back at the shaft. I don't know why I went there. Maybe some part of me thought I could stop this, or maybe I was just drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. The glow from the monolith was blinding now, the green light spilling out in waves, pulsing like a heartbeat. The cracks had widened, and from the depths came a sound I'll never forget, a deep, guttural roar that shook me to my core. Something was coming through. Mr. Black was there, standing at the edge of the shaft with a strange, almost serene look on his face. "You see?" he said as I approached. "This is what I've been waiting for, the beginning of a new era." "You're insane," I said, my voice shaking. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." He turned to me, smiling faintly. "It's not about understanding. It's about being part of something greater." Before I could stop him, he stepped forward and disappeared into the mist. The roar grew louder, and I knew I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I saw something rising from the shaft. It wasn't like the figures from before. This was something much, much worse. It was massive, its form shifting and writhing like it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. Tentacles, limbs, eyes, all of it blended together in a grotesque, ever-changing mass. And at its center, a single glowing eye, staring directly at me. I don't remember how I got back to the surface. The next thing I knew, I was running through the desert, the camp far behind me. The green light still burned on the horizon, casting eerie shadows across the sand. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found a road. A passing truck picked me up, and I begged the driver to take me as far away as possible. That was 3 days ago. I haven't slept since. Every time I close my eyes, I see that thing, the eye, the mist, the way it moved, and the knocking. It's still there, in the back of my mind, like a heartbeat I can't escape. I don't know what happened to the camp. I haven't seen anything on the news, but I wouldn't expect to. Whatever this was, they'll bury it, just like they buried whatever was in that shaft. But I can feel it. It's not over, because sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. 3 knocks, and I know it's still out there, waiting.